Welcome to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin,
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
and we are delighted to be joined by a very special guest today. Our guest is Bishop Erik Varden, who is the Bishop of the Territorial Prelature of Trondheim in Norway. Bobby and I are both big fans of Bishop Varden's work, and so we are just thrilled that he was free to join us for a conversation today. Bishop Varden, welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm fine, thank you. Delighting in spring at last.
Oh, yes. Well, I know the winters are long in your part of the world, as they are in Bobby's in Poland. I'm in Texas, so it's kind of a funny climate here. But glad to know that the flowers are blooming in your part of the world. Um, we have a lot that we wanted to get to in our conversation with you today, but we thought maybe we could start at the beginning with you because, like you, I am a convert to the Catholic Church, and you come from a part of the world where there aren't very many Catholics, and now you've gone back there to be the bishop there. I wonder if you could just talk to our listeners and viewers just a little bit about your journey of faith into the Catholic Church.
Well, very briefly, I was born in Norway in 1974 into into a nominally Christian family. I was baptized as a child, and we had the practice of praying before bedtime and going to church on Christmas Eve. But that was about it as far as explicit religious practice went. Um, I went through a time as an adolescent, declaring myself with a degree of self-satisfied pride and a degree of vanity, an adolescent, no, an agnostic, and even an atheist, without really plumbing the full depth of those words, I think, but with a sort of certainty one is entitled to have when one is 15. But at about that time, when I was 15, 16, I had a kind of an awakening to the supernatural that occurred through an experience of music that made me conscious that there was something in me that exceeded me, that I carried something in me that was greater than I, and that seemed to correspond to the notion of the supernatural. I don't think I had initially the confidence or the courage to call it God, but I developed that courage and that certainty with time. At about that same time, I left Norway to go to attend an international sixth form school in the United Kingdom. And I went from there to study. So I remained in England. And during that time, through friendship, through reading, through chance encounters, through art, and through a visit to a monastery that I more or less made by mistake, one thing led to another, and I was received into the church in my first year as an undergraduate when I was 19 years old.
Wow. Father, you said I actually listened to a previous interview in which you mentioned the first time you saw the monks living in the monastery, the radicalness of that attracting you. What was that like? Because I read too, I teach in an international school in Krakow, and we have the IB. And it's interesting. A lot of the students they kind of come from, I mean, it's international school, cosmopolitan, not much exposure to a religious tradition. But actually interesting. You mentioned music. Once you show them something beautiful, like a particular film, there you can see in their eyes this sparkle and this real strong interest. And the other day, I was actually because I teach them history, and I was introducing Mount Athos to them, and this was just so foreign to them, but at the same time attractive. Based on this previous conversation I listened of yours, it sounded like something similar was happening in you.
I think so. Oh, you mentioned you show them films. What sort of films do you show them?
Okay, well, here's a long list. Okay, I hope we can talk about this. I I used to teach a class. This is not at this at this school now, but I used to show him Kieślowski films. So the
Hmm.
Decalogue, the first Decalogue film, I used to show him that. And that movie, I used to teach this Christian morality class, and that film was like profound. Students were talking about that
Hmm.
like, weeks after the showing of that. Um, Actually, this last couple, I showed them Roman Polanski's The Pianist not too
Hmm.
long ago because we are doing a section on World War II and the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. And actually, most recently, um, you know what? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I kind of regret showing them this film by Bryan Singer, The Untouchables in Chicago. And it was, I don't know if you've seen this film because we were
I
talking
haven't.
about,
I know about it, but I
but
haven't seen it.
yes, I know you had some, you mentioned, because I know Tarantino upholds Brian's, not Brian, is it Brian? It's Brian De Palma. Sorry, I apologize. But he's quite graphic in the violence, and I forgot about all that stuff when I was showing the film. I think it was just kind of like a, PG-13 gangster film. But it is quite graphic. So that was the last film I showed, actually, a little regrettably. So.
Okay.
That's a little bit. I could go on and talk too much, but I'll
You
end
will have
there.
to have to show them something pastoral and gentle next.
Yes. Well, I tried showing them Terrence Malick once,
Okay.
and that was actually a disaster. I mean, because they just kept asking me, when is this going to be over? They were bored out of their minds.
Hmm.
So,
But they sat through Kieślowski.
oh yes, I think it was the relationship of the father and the son
Hmm.
that was, and then the music, I think that's the Preissner music. It was just so eerie. And at the very end, there's just the way Kieślowski like just his cinematography, there's like something prayerful in it. Like there's this contemplative dimension that I don't know how to like put into words, but you know that every single thing in the on the screen or that's being captured on film is there intentionally. I mean, I know all directors do this, but there's just this meaningfulness in everything in
Hmm.
Kieślowski, and that I think captivated them. And also the way he kind of captures the face in the drama,
Hmm.
um, I think was unlike any experience they've had in cinema. It was something like they weren't being entertained and but they were really experiencing cinema as an art form. And I
Hmm.
think was a little bit strange for them. So,
Oh, that's a wonderful awakening.
oh yeah, it was. I mean, I tear up every time I watch the first Decalogue, so they could see the emotion in
It is
my
an
face.
exceptional work that, and yeah, no, just hearing you talk about it now, I recall specific images from it.
Yeah. No, it's especially, like with the whole thing with the ice and this kind of this desire to control everything, the father. I mean, some of our viewers might not know much, but I encourage people to go watch the first Decalogue. I think Roger Ebert actually taught a whole class at the University of Chicago on the Decalogue. Uh, but this kind of desire to control, and even when the father or the son asks the father, what does it mean to die? And the father just says, well, your heart stops pumping.
Mhm.
And then he asks him again, no, what does it really mean? And it's this kind of like, this existential question that I think Kieślowski, I know Kieślowski in Poland is sometimes critiqued. I think there was he was, I see here, I'm doing all the talking. I apologize.
No,
He was actually, I think, hurt because I think a Jesuit wrote an article against his some of his films, and he's not kind of like a maybe like a traditional Orthodox Catholic. I really don't know too much about his practice of the faith, but there's something so profound in his films that I can't but see it as like you say, like conducive to this spiritual awakening. So
no.
I don't know if I've heard you mention Kieślowski, and I was actually talking to Andrew before this. I was kind of hoping Bishop might say some words on Kieślowski because the last conversation got into that a little bit, but I was just really desiring some more.
No, I've been a fan for years, since I think I discovered him through the Red, White, Blue trilogy.
Hmm.
Um, and then I watched the Decalogue, all 10 films, and some of them I watched several times. And then that extraordinary film, The Double Life of Veronique. And I also think he is one of those rare directors who can catch the numinous on screen and can awaken, can cause that consciousness uh, of uh, of life as somehow of life as being deeply purposeful.
Mhm.
Mm, and he doesn't provide easy answers, and he's certainly not he's 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 not an evangelizing missionary director, but he has an ability to show life in its ultimate reality that I think cannot but be compelling.
Yeah, that I think that's well put about Kieślowski and a lot of other great filmmakers. And Bobby and I write about and talk about European cinema quite a bit, and other European literature and art and all of that. We're both American citizens, but we both had experience living in Europe. And one of the things that we are doing in our little project at the Space Alvey Institute is sort of looking to Europe. And in particular, these kind of marks of European, sort of marks of a Christian past that are still kind of deep in European civilization, even where kind of official secularism maybe has taken the place once occupied by a kind of official Christianity. And I'm wondering from your perspective in Norway, which I think most people would consider to be a pretty thoroughly secular country, um, how do you kind of approach your role as a minister of the gospel, as a Catholic bishop, kind of living and working in a world that was obviously once totally defined by the Christian faith, by the Catholic Church at one time, obviously, until the Reformation. I just love to hear your perspective on kind of being there in Europe, and particularly there in Northern Europe and in Norway, and representing Christ and His Church.
Well, I think I start by saying that I'm afraid I'd be a little bit more cynical and perhaps doubt the possibility that any society might be totally defined by faith.
Hmm.
Um, uh, that's obviously in the context of Catholic Norway. One thinks um, of the voice of Sigrid Undset, and I'm intrigued by the fact that there is an Undset revival going on in the Anglosphere, which is related to the new translations that have been brought out, translations by Tina Nunnally, of Kristin Lavransdatter and Olav Odunson. But I noticed that people are reading other things as well. And one of the things that she portrays very powerfully towards the end of Kristin Lavransdatter, which is set in the 13th century, so at the height of Christian civilization in this country, and a scene that plays out, I mean, very near to where I'm sitting now in Trondheim, which was the country's Christian capital. But she shows how at times of extreme tension and trial, a time of pestilence, um, people have recourse, or they rediscover a kind of a pagan depth in themselves, um, that is a desperate attempt to face the fear of death.
Hmm.
Um, and I think she, who had a very high idea of the Christian, of the saturated Christian culture of the Norwegian Middle Ages, still had that realism that a civilization is never entirely evangelized, that
Hmm.
it's always ongoing work and unfinished business. And in a way, I think our situation now probably isn't all that unlike the situation of previous times. It's true that Christianity is no longer a majority position. It doesn't represent a majority perspective on life. But I do think that we have, in our country, or in the countries of Scandinavia, reached a sort of turning point where I'd say we find ourselves now no longer in a post-Christian society, but we're entering a kind of post-secularism. Um,
Hmm.
and I've sometimes found myself saying that I think that secularization is finished in Norway, which isn't to say that there is a tremendous religious revival, but in a way, it's just acknowledging that that work is done. There is, in terms of structures and presuppositions, there's nothing left to secularize.
Hmm.
And it goes without saying that secularization is not an infinite process because the concept of infinity is ruled out. Um, and yet, what we find is not people lying back in their deck chairs and reaching for another glass of Pimm's saying, oh, good riddance, but a new kind of search. And we see that throughout the country. We see it in the Catholic Church in Norway, but the other denominations see it too, that there is a renewed volume of seekers and a new seriousness of seeking. And I find not least with our young people now, uh, a much greater maturity than the people their age would have had 15 years ago or when I was their age.
Is that because when you were younger, the process of kind of, you know, secularization or kind of wading through what it meant to be a kind of post-Christian country was still underway, and now
Very
that's
much so. I
finished?
mean,
Yeah.
when I grew up in this country in the 70s and 80s, um, the church understood as a generic entity, so organized Christianity, still represented a cultural force that was perceived, not always with very good reason, as being repressive and old-fashioned and stuck in the mud and standing in the way of progress, etc. So it was a societal force against which one rebelled and against which one fought to a certain extent. But now it's become so marginal that it it wouldn't occur to anyone to fight it.
Hmm.
Um, and it's interesting and in some ways rather uncanny to note just how quickly a cultural memory is lost. When I was growing up, every Norwegian would have been certain, not always with good reason, that they had a very clear idea of what Christianity was. Now, a large number of people would have no qualms about admitting that they have not the faintest idea, and they're not ashamed of that.
Hmm.
That's that's a cultural loss and a cultural failing in a way, but it's also a tremendous opportunity because it means that you can tell the story afresh
Mhm.
and obviously try to witness to it. And you asked what the task is now of a priest and a bishop in this country, and I think it is to try and expound the gospel and to expound the basis of Christian hope without compromise, intelligibly and humanely and compassionately, and then to live coherent lives.
Bishop, could you, I'm sorry, Andrea, but along these lines, you mentioned that since we're not maybe reacting and pushing against um, the church, um, we also maybe there's an indifferentism, but there's a search there, but we kind of lack the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to make sense of some of these desires and this longing. You mentioned that for the numinous. Uh, in your book that I think Word on Fire recently published, you have a chapter in there that I thought it was very interesting that you do not like the word spirituality, at
Oh,
least as it is.
I
Uh,
have an axe to grind.
yes, yes, and I read that and I wholeheartedly agreed. At least in the way it was kind of presented to me when I was young. And I just like maybe just a little note. When I was growing up, and we had a generation like the Boomer generation teaching spirituality in the Catholic schools, it was something that conceptually, at least in my opinion, was quite weak. Um, I remember having the choice between taking a class on economics and spirituality. And at first glance, I thought there's nothing intelligible in the spirituality class to really kind of grapple. How are you going to have a class on this? But I eventually did take the spirituality class, and it actually was funny because the priest did mention a critique of the word spirituality the first day of the class. So could you maybe say like what are some of those like concepts and that vocabulary that we need to like learn afresh that's so important for our times. I mean, one word that stuck out to me, I remember reading Charles Taylor's Secular Age, and he ends with the word theosis, and I never heard that word before,
Mhm.
and I was so captivated. So it got me into reading like some of the church fathers, and I was like, I had no idea this is the whole goal of the spiritual life. So I don't know if that's one of the words you might have in mind.
I think it's an essential word, and it's a word that I try in my own little way to develop now and again. Um, I always like to refer to that passage in the second letter of Peter that refers to the end of human existence as a sharing in divine nature. Um, and I think it's important to remind people that this aspiration is scripturally rooted. It isn't sort of a mystical Oriental excess, but it's there as part of the tradition passed on to us. In some ways, the sort of essayistic writing that I've been trying to engage with in the last few years has been and is an ongoing attempt to consider vocabulary and sometimes to try to repristinate vocabulary. Um, so in my book, The Shattering of Loneliness, that came out in 2018, I think that really hinges on um, an exposition of desire and an exposition of desire in tandem with and to a certain extent over against longing, uh, which I believe to be definitive of human existence. I also try to look in that book at the significance of the notion of truth. Um, then I wrote that book, which is simply called Chastity. That is, in a way, a semantic essay that endeavors to try and blow some of the dust and clean some of the grime off this word that has become so utterly useless and that has so many negative connotations attaching to it that it's, as I point out in the book, that it's useless even for satire. Um, but I've been trying to suggest that it may actually have something very interesting and helpful to say to us now. And yeah, and in some more recent essays, I've looked at liberty. That's, for freedom, Christ has set us free. To be a Christian is by definition to be someone in pursuit of freedom. What does that mean? And also to consider what it means to be and to want to be fully alive. As I was celebrating a confirmation yesterday, and I was saying to the young people, the church is basically a society of persons hungry for life.
Yeah. That's a wonderful word, and it's something Bobby and I have talked about a lot too. Is just kind of how important it is to kind of stress the idea that the church is not just a kind of yeah, a place to kind of explore spirituality, but indeed the place to experience reality, the place
Absolutely.
to be fully alive. And I know that you've talked and written as well just about kind of this fundamental crisis of what it means to be a human being, which in some respects gets at the heart of a lot of these questions that we've been bouncing around together already. Not only do we live in a world that has lost the grammar of religion or kind of the basics of Christianity or whatever, but even just the basics of what it means to be a human being. I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
I think it is bound to be the most urgent question of our times. And it is an immense paradox that in our hyper sophisticated age, where we're able to define all manner of phenomena with extreme precision, that we should find ourselves so utterly incapable of even articulating what it means to be human. And that we're surrounded by so many conflicting and downright absurd answers. And that even the question of what it is to be male and what it is to be female is now such a minefield that even daring explorers rather take another route. And so I do think it is really important to speak of humanity and human being in terms of its origin, referring to the revealed message of Scripture, going back to the protology. And I find, I mean, I've been expounding, commenting on, pondering, praying about the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis for the past 25 years. And the more I engage with that, the more I find them to be inexhaustible. And so much of the theology of the church fathers of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries were about an engagement with that original creative purpose of God in making man. And of course, the great conciliar labor of um, of speaking clearly and coherently the meaning of the incarnation, of speaking what it means to assert that God has become man, has immense implications for our understanding of what it is to be a human being, touched by divinity. And of course, the fathers would see a necessary and a logical connection between the redemptive work of incarnation and the original creative work of calling man into being. So I think that is a crucial task. And then, as Robert said earlier on, it is essential to point towards what we're called to be and what we have the potential to become. That a fulfillment of our humanity is in itself a wonderful thing, but we are still hungry for more. And that hunger for unlimitedness is in fact not crazy. It is on the contrary, an extremely rational hunger that is imprinted logically on our deepest being and that speaks to us. Uh, you can know God.
Just saying that you can know God. That is, I mean, maybe I'll say it's just something to teaching. I'm so eager sometimes to share these things with the students, even though it's not related to the class material. But I gave the students the other day, because in the t theory of knowledge class, there is a section on religion, and I decided to give them one of the arguments for the existence of God. But I chose the one where, God is to think about what is it, actuality and potentiality.
Mhm,
And the students never thought of this, but God as pure act, and I let them sit with that for a little bit. And the fact that we can know that about God and know that God uh, necessarily exists, it was just so. I mean, even saying this to the students, you assent to that with a kind of a desire in your heart that for that, and it gives you this order and purpose in
mhm.
your life that you're orientated to that. Um, I I was also contemplating the first three chapters of Genesis um, during the Triduum. I have to go to Polish. My wife is, from Poland, and my Polish isn't good enough yet to fully understand the homily. So sometimes I just sneak in the Bible with me, and I read from one of the scriptures. And I was reading the first three chapters of Genesis during the Triduum. And I mean, there is just it's inexhaustible, as you said. There's so much there. Um, I wanted to ask you, Bishop, because you taught for a number of years, I believe at San Anselmo in Rome, and it says that you taught the Syrian Christianity. What led you into that? Uh, and what was like? Yeah, what was so fascinating about that, and any insights you drew from that? Because I think many people have never really learned much about the profound Christianity and profound Christian tradition in Syrian.
Well, what I always like to remind myself and other people of is that Christianity is an Oriental religion.
Hmm.
Um, um, and obviously, Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, which became the normative form of Aramaic. That was the language that Christ and the apostles spoke. So Syriac takes us as close to the source language of the Christian revelation as we can get. Because it's important to remember that our fundamental source text, when it comes to the teaching and example of Jesus Christ, is already a translation. The Greek source text is already a rendering of words that were spoken in another and very different language. So that was one factor that fascinated me, that I wanted to get as close to the originals. And I was hungry to have something to get something of a sense of the spokenness. I wanted to know what it sounded like. Um, and then there was an antecedent reason in a way. When I was at this school in Wales, Atlantic College, where the IB was developed,
Yeah, I know.
um, uh, I had a roommate who's an Iraqi, and he introduced me to various elements of Arabic thought and Arabic tradition and Arabic language. And in fact, my original intention was to study Arabic at university. Um, I ended up changing my mind just before coming up, and I started doing theology instead. But I did have this long-standing interest in in Semitic languages, and there is an evident um, linguistic link between Aramaic, Syriac, and Arabic. They belong to the same language family. And then a third reason was exposure in the novitiate at Mount St. Bernard to some of the Syriac monastic tradition that I found reading in Lectio Divina. And in that respect, I'm particularly grateful, as are so many other people, to Sebastian Brock, who was reader in Syriac at Oxford for many decades and who trained several generations of Syriac scholars, and who, by his own patient and learned and humane endeavors, has done more than any other person in recent history, I think, to bring the Syriac Christian tradition into Western consciousness and to make us see what treasures are there. So reading his works and his translations really fired something in me. And so when I started studying Syriac a bit on my own, and then when my abbot offered me the chance to go and do a licentiate in Rome in order that I obtain a pontifical degree, and he asked me if I had any preferences, I suggested the Oriental Institute, and he said yes. So I could go there and study more of it. And then, rather to my surprise, I was asked to teach us at Santa Selma for a couple of years.
It's remarkable. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, Bishop Varden, and ask you about something that you've recently done. A couple of months ago, in February of 2026, you preached at a week-long Lenten retreat for Pope Leo XIV and the Roman Curia, which is an extremely, for listeners and viewers who don't know, it's a high honor and certainly reserved for someone who has a very interesting and important voice and message to share with the church. I'm just wondering what that experience was like for you, being around the Pope and the Curia and having that opportunity.
Well, it was a very humbling experience and a very edifying one. Because it really was a retreat that was soaked in prayer and where there was an atmosphere of real recollection and attention. So I came away very edified by the assembly.
Do you think that obviously you were appointed by Pope Francis to your current position, and now we have Pope Leo XIV. I mean, one of the things that Bobby and I have been kind of tracing in our work, kind of starting with John Paul II, and then we focus a lot on Benedict XVI, and then Pope Francis, and now Pope Leo. We found in each of our current Pope and in our recent popes a real sensitivity to the kind of presenting issues of the day. And, we're hopeful, for example, in Pope Leo XIV, that there's going to be some real clarity that may be provided about, for example, technology and artificial intelligence. And, some of the issues that really do impinge on these questions of humanity and culture, what it means to be a human being and that sort of thing. Do you get a sense that that's kind of the intellectual movement around our current Pope? And I wonder what your own kind of role is in that sort of thing.
I think we can affirm that that is the case. I don't know whether you read or heard the discourse that the Pope gave just last week at the Catholic University in Yaoundé in Cameroon, where he spoke specifically about these issues, and where I dare say we can find some elements that will recur in magisterial teaching, both acknowledging the immense benefits of technological advance, but owning at the same time the perils intrinsic to it and some of the harmful effects we see in people's personal lives. I mean, we're all too familiar with the the impact of digital media and social media on children and teenagers. And I think it's a blessing really of the particular period we're entering now that it's possible to look lucidly and with a sanely critical eye on technological advance, and not to be simply blown away by the mystery and fascination of it, but having now the basis for empirical study to evaluate its impact on human creativity, on human well-being, and on human sociability. So I think that will certainly continue to be a core issue.
It's amazing, how many books are coming out on technology, but also talking about a disciplined life and looking um, at monasticism. A couple of years ago, there was a book that came out on this, and there's been so many coming out recently that I'm wondering if you guys seen an increase in the number of young men who seek to enter the Cistercians around the world. I mean, even in Norway, do you find this?
In terms of in terms of my order, the Cistercian order of the strict observance, I wouldn't say that we see a flood wave of new vocations. On the contrary, this is a time of penury, really, and the order is facing now the prospect of multiple closures of monasteries. Um, that that is sad, but which is also related um, to the perhaps uh, unmeasured enthusiasm of the great decades of growth of the 50s and 60s, when a lot of foundations were made, and when one had a tendency to think perhaps that the vocational flourishing of those decades would represent a new norm that would remain permanent. So in a way, there's probably a stabilization that we're seeing now. That said, I find both here um, in in the diocese and in the places that are entrusted to me now, I do find an increased vocational interest, and I find young people, men and women, asking themselves the question of the particular task and purpose of their lives with a new seriousness. And I think around the world, we do see signs now of a cautious but nevertheless coherent vocational awakening. And that throws the ball back into the court of the established orders, really, and causes them to have to ask themselves whether they are equipped and ready to receive new life.
Mm. Bishop, here in the United States, we hear reports about, very encouraging stories about, large numbers of people who are coming into the church at the Easter Vigil. And, there've been a couple of interesting reports lately about the interest among especially men under 30 who are discovering kind of religion and coming into the Catholic Church. Then, on the other hand, there are commentators who say, well, yes, that's all encouraging, but we're still looking at net losses. We're still looking at, we are actually still, if not declining, more or less staying the same, even though we can point to these very encouraging things. But I wonder, if what we really are finally getting at is something like what Pope Benedict talked about, a sort of smaller and more faithful church. And what I would take that as is not that, we're becoming kind of more trad or kind of more reactionary or something like that, but like we are actually drawing into the church all different kinds of people, maybe not in kind of the larger numbers of that would have been the case in a kind of more cultural Catholicism or cultural Christianity, but still, very, very encouraging numbers, relatively speaking. I don't know if that's the case for where you are in Norway or what you see in Europe, but this is sort of the way that I'm thinking here in the United States.
Absolutely. It's a pattern that we recognize and that we see again growing consistently. And I think this is an area in which statistics um, statistics can't be exhaustive and touch the limit of their relevance really, because it's not just a matter of maintaining numbers. I think what we're seeing now is a new kind of groundswell, and I think the possibility of a, a cultural change that, of course, has to be maintained. Uh, we have um, the numbers of people who come to seek to be instructed in the faith, to be received or even baptized, and that is wonderful. We also know now from the experience of the last 5 years or so that there are a lot of people who abandon practice after 2 years or 3 years. And so we must, as parishes, communities, congregations, be extremely conscious of our responsibility to accompany, befriend, nurture, and activate these new members coming. There is a risk in traditionally and residually Christian countries or Christian terrains to think too much in terms of territorial gain or territorial reconquest. We look at our past and we say, all this used to belong to our forefathers. Now we have only this much left. We must get back to the full extent of our territory. But that not only is it an absurdly reductionist perspective, but it's even a dangerous perspective because we risk putting ourselves and our own ambition, our own desire for significance, stature, status, a sense of importance before the communication of the saving good news of Jesus Christ. So I think it's important now to be very conscious of the Spirit's work, to try not to be obstacles to that work, to try to collaborate with it as best we can, and at the same time to remain humble and to shun any kind of facile triumphalism, which is not only untrue, because a Christian has a Christian is called to be grateful, and a Christian is called to rejoice, but never to be triumphalist. And also triumphalism is just so boring.
I'm glad you use that word boring because, yeah, I think that's the heart of it. At the end of the day, a lot of these initiatives, like you said, you mentioned conquest and other things. You got to like really paying attention to the work of the Spirit. What's the intention behind that is so
Mhm.
key because it is boring at the end of the day. Um, but Andrew and I, when we started this initiative, it was the word hope. This is like a couple of years ago. Now the word I'm finding it everywhere, it seems. It's not a boring word, but it's almost kind of become a cliche now. I mean, we had the year of hope, but that word is just so powerful. I read Charles Peguy a number of years ago, and I at the time I didn't like the portal of the mystery of hope, um, but I went back to it. And the poem just keeps growing on me. And this was partially why. I mean, Charles Piggy, I know is a pretty complicated figure, but he is not boring at all. And I'm wondering it like because your latest book, Towards Dawn: Essays in Hopefulness. Um, Other than it being the year of hope last year, was there something about like do you have any words? I mean, you communicate this in the book, but the chapters are, you know, it's interesting. I really the chapter on Epic of Gilgamesh is really good, and uh, I'm getting into the one on I think it's on confirmation at the end there. But do you have any words to share with us about hope?
First and foremost, I'd stress that hope is not wishful thinking, and hope is not optimism. Hope presupposes realism, um, and realism presupposes courage. So, in order to equip ourselves to be hopeful people, we've got to uh, practice and rehearse the virtue of courage, and we've got to practice the ability to see things as they are, to see ourselves as we are, to see the world as it is, and refuse the temptation to despair. Obviously, in terms of of Latin etymology, the relatedness in terms of opposition of space and desperatio, of hope and despair, is evident. In English, less so, because they're drawn two different roots. Um, but hope is the medicine against despair. And despair, as far as I can see, is like a latent disease in our times. If you dig a little bit under the surface of the Instagram profile, where everything is perfect, um, I find that a lot of people are seriously doubtful as to whether anything makes any sense, as to whether there is any real cause to keep on living indefinitely, and as to whether the world has a future. And Christian hope will come into its own when when a person can look straightforwardly and peacefully into those abysses of apparent meaninglessness and yet affirm the meaningfulness of human endeavor, which involves the meaningfulness also of experience of pain and suffering, an extremely relevant topic for our times, and is able to affirm from intellectual conviction and from experience that this world which is entrusted to us and which we live and struggle and delight and suffer has been saved, and that its saving is definitive and dependable, and that therefore there is no circumstance which is beyond the reach of grace and of gracious transformation. That, I think, is the sort of register in which hope is enacted and becomes persuasive.
Oh, go ahead, please, Bishop.
No, 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 and because I think sometimes that that was my own perception for quite a while when I was young, a teenager. I thought Christians were people who presupposed a make-believe world, um, and who were obliged to walk around with pinned-on smiles. But that's not it at all.
Exactly right. Very, very, very helpful in clarifying. Our guest today has been Bishop Erik Varden. To all of our listeners and viewers, we thank you so much for taking the time to listen in on this great conversation, one of many in the catalog that we've been building with some of the most important thinkers kind of in the Catholic world and in the world of the arts and the intellectual world of the West. And we certainly include Bishop Erik Varden in all of those categories. If you're listening and watching this, we'd encourage you to like and share this episode. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd encourage you to leave any comment or question at all. That really does help draw people's attention to the videos that we post there. Once again, Bishop Erik Varden, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, we encourage you to continue to live in hope, and God bless.